Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about the Israeli pressure cooker. Let's get started. On our last week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report, we talked about the blame game that's going around right now, especially in regards to the ceasefire talks. And we talked a little bit about how the Israelis are being blamed for essentially everything. And we had a few follow-up questions that came in through our JDR.podcast DMs, and I wanted to address them a little bit along with the current events and the ongoing news that's coming out of Israel. As we said on last week's podcast, it is really incredible to see how Jewish hostages have been murdered by Hamas terrorists in Rafah, and somehow the Israelis are getting pressured by the international world. They're being blamed for not doing enough to save their own people, while everyone essentially ignores Hamas. We had a number of people on our Instagram DMs message and ask for a little bit more detail and a little more explanation about why this is happening and what the ramifications are for the fact that it is happening. It is anyone's guess, really, why this is happening. But an educated guess would essentially be, and this has been said by other people, not just me, that when you're dealing with a sovereign democratic nation, on the one hand, and you're dealing with a terrorist group filled with genocidal people who have essentially nothing in mind other than murdering the Jews and the Israelis, obviously there's only one side of the equation here that you can actually speak to. The Americans don't speak to Hamas. They actually have to go through intermediaries to speak to Hamas. The Israelis don't really speak to Hamas. Nobody is going to be able to put pressure on a group whose literal claim is that they want to do October 7th again. So since the international world really can't talk to or put pressure on or say anything about Hamas and are not willing to deal with the United Nations, who is in full support of Hamas. We've seen that on this podcast a few places, especially UNRWA, UNRWA, who are absolutely 100% in bed with Hamas. You know, the international world, in theory, could put pressure on them by, for example, cutting their funding, which many countries did do, and then almost entirely have now gone back on that promise and started funding again. So if you can't really pressure Hamas, then what do? You pressure Israel, because Israel is the only people who technically kind of have to listen to you. Israel is a sovereign nation. It's a democracy. It has to talk to its allies. It unfortunately gets weapons from the United States, and we'll talk about that in a second. So therefore, U.S. policy decides what Israel should and shouldn't do, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. For those of you who are unaware at the current aid situation to Israel, most people just assume that the money flows out of the United States pocket and right into the Israelis' pocket, and they can do whatever they want with it. But that isn't the case. Almost entirely, the aid that comes from the United States is essentially credit. It's vouchers to be bought with American weapons companies. Israel, that used to have a massive weapons industry where they made all of their own weapons because nobody would send them any kind of weaponry, they had to make their own. That was until the United States got involved and started essentially telling Israel, you can only buy weapons from us if you want our help. Great ally, right? So now that Israel makes very few of its own weapons and armor and ammunition and things like that, they rely on the United States, which means the United States has a lot of power. It's a really unfortunate situation that Israel is so reliant on the United States. And many people have suggested they really shouldn't be relying on the United States in this way. So international world does get to put, unfortunately, pressure on Israel. And it, in theory, works, because Israel is, unfortunately, fairly reliant on these countries now that they have demolished their own weapons industries. And on the other hand, I'll be honest, I don't hold my breath, but I really don't think Iran and Qatar, the people who fund Hamas, really are going to be withholding any funds from Hamas anytime soon. Do you think they mind that Hamas is killing Israelis? Pretty sure that's their entire aim. And as we know, it was an attempt to get the UN to stop funding Hamas, but that was really quickly turned around with some great PR and some fake documents created about how Hamas doesn't get money from the UN and sorry, some few mistakes happened, but we'll fix it and don't worry about it. The don't worry your pretty little head approach. And pretty much every country has started funding UNRWA all over again. So in essence, the pressure that Israel feels is not being put on Hamas because the people who fund them are more than happy with them murdering Jews all over the place and killing Israelis at any chance they get. So that funding is never going to go away. Only Israel's support. So obviously we can see that Hamas is in no rush to be pressured by anybody to do literally anything different. Even the United States, who vaguely says, release the hostages. The UN and the International Court of Justice have told them to release the hostages. They don't care. There's literally no pressure on them. The only pressure that exists on Hamas is the ones that Israel puts through war and other kind of military means. But what has this really done on the ground, this whole pressure campaign against Israel? On the one hand, you have obviously Israel needing to give up some of its ability to do what it wants in order to worry about world opinion or its allies' opinion. And the most obvious example of that is in Rafah. A number of weeks ago, when I was standing literally overlooking Gaza in Sderot, I hear from the guy who was giving us the tour, who once himself was in the army, and during one of the conflicts in Gaza, said that the Israeli army took over the entire Gaza Strip, that conflict, whatever year that was, in 2 weeks. 2 weeks it took to take over the entire Gaza Strip. And yet, at this point, I think it's safe to say Israel has probably taken over the entire Gaza Strip, but it took them about 8 months. So obviously Israel could, in theory, take over that entire land in no time with no problems whatsoever, but they didn't. And that was exactly because of the international pressure. We all remember the absolutely crazy all eyes on Rafah, where the American administration was saying under no circumstances are you allowed to go into Rafah. Don't go into Rafah or else. Meanwhile, there are hostages in Rafah. Hamas is in Rafah. No one told Hamas to stay out of Rafah. That is a perfect example of what happens when Israel is being handcuffed, essentially, by the international world or by their allies. The pressure campaign caused them to take what should have been a 2-week mission to be an 8-month mission. And some say maybe had they not waited so long, it's possible that those 6 hostages would still be alive today. But last week we also talked in the podcast about the internal struggles within Israel. And if you haven't heard that episode, please go back and listen to it. The fact is that internally, there are a lot of divides in Israeli society. You see the protests happening, the anti-Bibi stuff, the bring them home stuff. So in addition to the external struggles and pressure, you obviously have internal pressure. There are a lot of people who want Bibi gone. There are a lot of people who want Bibi to attack harder, to not bow to international pressure. There's a lot of internal pressure, without a doubt. And that, of course, weighs on the situation. The pressure obviously continues to sit on his shoulders. And something that I saw this week really points out this pressure and how Hamas is taking advantage of it. The Hamas PR team put together a little video that they cut up some footage and put some titles and text on it, not only in Arabic, but of course in Hebrew as well. This video was intended for Israeli audiences, hence the Hebrew. And the reason they put it out was blaming Netanyahu for the death of the hostages, which is ironic and stupid considering they themselves murdered and called for the murder of any hostages, but they were playing into this internal pressure. They're not blind to the international media. They see all of the protests happening all over CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, whatever it might be, and they say this is working. So let's find a way to trigger the internal pressure and take it up a notch. And this video was not only blaming Netanyahu for the death, but essentially had the tagline and the slogan that if Bibi Netanyahu stays in power, Hamas will kill more Israeli hostages. And this was directed right at the Israeli people in order to fan the flames that are happening. Because they're not stupid. They're watching the media that all last week was promoting the horrible anti-Bibi things that were happening, the big protests, how angry Israelis are about the dead hostages. Hamas sees this and is gleeful. They love this. This is the greatest thing they've ever done. They have been working so hard at this. And I'll tell you a little bit of the history and how we got here, but it is unreal the amount of time and effort, and I hate to say dead people, they have essentially put on the line to get where we are today. In theory, the PR/pressure campaign that comes from Hamas is not a new thing. It is essentially built into the Palestinian Arab DNA and their identity because, let's be honest, the Palestinian identity is relatively new and only started long after their supposed nationality existed. But if you think back to the original situation in 1948, before they were even quote-unquote Palestinians, the Nakba narrative was the first international PR campaign, essentially, of the Palestinian Arabs. They took an event that was clear as day for anybody who existed in that time, anybody in the region, anybody looking at the news. If you think about all of those newspaper headings, Arabs invade Palestine, pretty clear. And yet, immediately, they lost the war and then spun it to suggest that it's a Nakba, a catastrophe. It was a terrible thing that happened to them. The PR campaign started right from the beginning. And let's be honest, it's still happening today with that same Nakba narrative, which, by the way, has been long disproven by many scholars and even Palestinian Arab people themselves from the time who said it literally never happened. It wasn't this mass murder expulsion by Jews kicking people out of their homes. It literally didn't happen. But since 1948, this has been the biggest PR campaign probably in world history. They created a fake identity. They created a fake catastrophe. They created a fake nationhood. And then they essentially went out and spread it around the world and got people to believe it. And it took a while. It's been about 70 years of essentially playing this PR game. And every single conflict that they started, that they began, every war, every intifada, gets wrapped around this PR BS that they've created, where they are the perpetual victims. They have never done anything wrong. When they do things that are wrong, it's for the right reasons. We kill people because we are resisting. And it's finally paying off. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, if you think back, you can think back and realize that not this many people were talking about the Palestinians back then. I mean, sure, it was a conflict in the world, and sure, some people had opinions on it, but you wouldn't see these rallies in the streets. You wouldn't see campuses taken over. This is a concerted effort. It is the ultimate pressure campaign, because not only does Hamas want to pressure using international media and lies and fake stories, they want to pressure internally on the Israeli government with their propaganda videos. But the third prong of this was essentially creating a world filled of people who believe their PR lies. The mass genocide, they're killing us, it's our land, they're stealing it, they expel us from our homes. All of these lies were on purpose. I don't know if Hamas or the Palestinian people really knew that this would take off as well as it did. Obviously, they had help from the Soviets and various other people. But what really supercharged this issue was social media, for one, was the buying off of universities in the United States, which we've talked about on this podcast before, by Arab dictators who install these anti-Jewish courses into these institutions. Again, if you'll go back and listen to our podcast, you'll hear about the statistics behind schools that accept foreign money from Arab dictators and the exponential growth of anti-Semitism on that campus. But most of all, and one of the biggest things, is the way that the Palestinian Arabs have essentially taken over the United Nations. The United Nations has been a cornerstone of not only funneling money to Hamas, but also running cover for them in the International Court, in the Security Council, everywhere across the board. They are supporting the Palestinian Arabs, even when they commit things like the October 7th attack. It was a long road, but really everything eventually fell into place. The old-fashioned newspaper stories really didn't do it as well as a social media account showing fake blown-up buildings or mothers crying with dolls in their hands pretending to be their dead babies. Nothing could have made the Palestinian Arab cause better than social media. And it doesn't help our cause that those social media companies also seem to love to promote those stories. And don't get me started on how many of my colleagues on Instagram, including myself, have been censored, banned, kicked off, whatever it might be, for simply posting something pro-Israel. This past week on Instagram, we posted a picture from TikTok, I believe. And I'm not even kidding you. This has been removed from TikTok for being, quote, inappropriate and breaking the guidelines of TikTok. A user posted the words, "Jews are from Judea. We are an ethno-religion." And that was a violation of community guidelines, according to TikTok. Meanwhile, they have accounts with 50 million people looking at complete lies of fake dead babies and fake people dead on the streets, all this other stuff. And that's totally fine. No fact-checking required. And don't get me started about the people wishing death upon Jewish accounts or pro-Israel accounts, and that too not apparently breaking guidelines. But pointing out a historical and actual fact of Jews come from Judea and that we are an ethno-religion, that's a bridge too far for TikTok. I don't know if the Palestinian Arab terrorist groups thought one day there'd be something called social media and that those social media groups would allow for their PR to spread like wildfire and amplify the voices of lies and then also take down voices of reality. But apparently they got their wish if that's what they hoped for. In the end, really we can see this pressure campaign trying to get the Israelis to do what the world wants, which may just be to roll over and die, essentially. But it's coming from a weird place. The international world is adding pressure, and therefore Hamas is using that pressure in order to add to it. And what is Hamas getting in return? Hamas is not giving up any kind of power. Hamas is not going to do anything in the way of negotiations. They get to sit back and essentially watch the world, Israel's internal politics, and social media turn against Israel, and then they can just keep waiting until eventually Israel just gives up. As long as Israel is the only thing and the only people being pressured, obviously Hamas isn't going to change. We can see that in their actions. The fact that they're releasing videos in order to try to add fuel to the fire of the Israeli internal politics, the fact that they keep turning down endless ceasefires because every time they turn them down, Israel gets blamed by the Americans. What incentive do they have to actually make a deal? It seems like not making a deal and more of their people dying because they use them as human shields equals better pressure for them. Israel has more pressure to make a deal and give up more. All you have to do is kill some hostages and you'll get some better ceasefire terms. I was talking to someone recently on our Instagram account, and it was a very interesting point that they made. They suggested that maybe if rather than every time they turn down a deal, nothing happens and only Israel is pressured, maybe Israel should find a way to pressure them. Or frankly, maybe the world should. Maybe for every time they turn down a ceasefire deal, Israel gets to keep 5 kilometers of Gaza. If you really think about it for a minute, can you actually see Hamas not making a deal if there were actual consequences? If for every time that they turn down a ceasefire, Israel says you are losing a certain amount of land and the world backed it up? Can you imagine if the world sat there and said, you're right, that's a great plan? The next day, Hamas would make a deal, for sure. As much as they don't like their people, they sure as heck don't want to lose the land that they have now. And by extension, maybe we can move that policy over to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria also. Maybe for every peace deal turned down, somehow they lose something, and maybe they'll be easier to make a deal with. We really need to find a way to switch the pressure and the pressure cooker from Israeli governments and move it to where it belongs, which is on the people who keep refusing ceasefire deals and the people who are holding hostages and the people who are saying they're going to do October 7th over and over again, and no longer put the pressure on the sovereign nation who is simply trying to defend itself and has accepted every ceasefire. The pressure cooker should really be on Hamas, if only the international world would allow that to happen. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.